The night I helped my boss get over his marriage, while his wife was not around, was definitely the most unexpected night I've ever experienced. I used to think men nearing 50 settled into their routines, didn't have much left to yearn for, especially when it came to love or anything near it. The men I'd known growing up, older uncles or family friends, seemed to fade quietly into the background of their own lives as they aged. But my 48-year-old boss, Mr. Sterling, quietly dismantled that misconception with every subtle glance, every moment we shared, and every unspoken word that hung in the air between us. Mr. Sterling lived alone most of the time. His wife traveled frequently, visiting family in another country, and it left their penthouse apartment eerily quiet. From the outside, everything about him seemed ordinary. He wore impeccably tailored suits, his office was always spotless, and his demeanor was cool and collected. It wasn't until this past summer that I began noticing the small cracks in that polished surface, revealing something more complex underneath. It started with a late night at the office. The city lights glowed outside, casting long shadows across the floor, and the air conditioning hummed in the background. I had settled at my desk, catching up on emails, when my gaze wandered to Mr. Sterling's office. The door was slightly ajar, and he was sitting at his desk, the faint glow of the computer screen illuminating his face as he massaged his temples. His expression was distant, as though his thoughts had wandered somewhere far away. At first, I didn't think much of it. I chalked his demeanor up to a long day and the absence of his wife. But something about the way he sat, shoulders slumped, gaze fixed on a far point, stuck with me. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was loneliness, a kind I understood deeply. For the next few nights, I found myself stealing glances at him. Sometimes I caught him staring off into space, other times he seemed to focus intently on the papers on his desk, as though they held answers to questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. The longer I watched him, the more the mystery of his quiet sadness pulled at me. There was something deeply human about it, something raw and unfiltered. One evening, as twilight painted the city in soft lavender hues, I noticed him again. He was leaning against the window of his office, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. For a moment, he glanced in my direction, catching my gaze. It wasn't awkward, it felt like a silent acknowledgement, like he knew I'd been watching. Instead of turning away, I decided to act. "Evening, Mr. Sterling," I called out, my voice breaking the comfortable quiet of the office. He hesitated before offering a small nod. "Evening, David," he replied, his voice carrying over the warm air. It was low and smooth, like the faint hum of a well-oiled machine. I stood, crossing the space between our desks before I could overthink my decision. As I approached his office, his eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside his desk. He smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Not at all. Company would be welcome." The chair creaked softly as I sat, and for a while neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was contemplative, like we both understood there was no rush to fill the space between us. Finally, I broke the quiet. "Rough day?" I asked, nodding toward the glass in his hand. He chuckled, a low sound that carried a hint of self-deprecation. "Not particularly. Just thinking." "Thinking about what?" I prompted, curious. He took a sip, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "About how life changes, about how it stays the same in ways you don't expect. Marriage, work, all of it. You wake up one day and you realize how much of your life has been spent for others." His words hung in the air, heavy and unfiltered. I wasn't sure what to say, so I stayed quiet, letting him continue if he wanted. "Don't get me wrong," he added after a moment, "I'm grateful for everything I have, but sometimes, when the apartment is quiet, you start wondering if you missed something along the way. Something you didn't even know you wanted." I glanced at him, his profile illuminated by the soft light spilling from the office. There was an honesty in his expression that I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "I think everyone feels that way at some point," I said finally, my voice soft. "We get so caught up in what we think we're supposed to do that we forget to ask ourselves what we want." Mr. Sterling turned to look at me, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, I wondered if I'd said too much, but then he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're wise for someone so young," he said, his tone teasing but warm. I laughed lightly, shaking my head. "Or just good at pretending." That made him laugh, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to lighten the air around us. It was the first time I'd seen him let go of the weight he carried, even if only for a moment. It felt like a small victory. As the evening deepened, we talked about everything and nothing. He told me stories from his younger days, about his first job, the risks he took, and how he'd met his wife. I shared bits of my life too, how I'd moved here a few years ago, my own struggles with finding my place in the world. The more we talked, the more I realized how much I enjoyed his company. There was something comforting about his presence, like sitting beside a steady fire on a cold night. Eventually, the conversation slowed, and we sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. I could feel his gaze shift to me every now and then, but I didn't turn to meet it, not yet. There was something unspoken in the air between us, something fragile and undefined, and I wasn't ready to break it. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time since I felt this at ease." "Thank you, David." His words caught me off guard, and I turned to look at him. His expression was open, vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. "You don't have to thank me," I said softly. "I'm glad to be here." For a moment, we just looked at each other, the quiet intimacy of the moment settling around us. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sudden revelation, it was a connection, simple and profound, that neither of us had anticipated. As the night stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something neither of us fully understood yet. And I can tell you, the beginning it was. This was only the kickoff of something I could never have imagined, not even in my wildest dreams. The days after that first conversation felt different. It wasn't as though anything monumental had changed, but there was a new layer to my days at the office. I'd find myself lingering near his office, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mr. Sterling. He was usually there, sometimes with his glass of amber liquid, other times just staring out the window, letting the stillness of the night envelop him. When our eyes inevitably met, it felt like an unspoken invitation. It didn't take long for our late-night office talks to become routine. A nod from him or a wave from me was all it took, and I'd find myself in his office, drawn to his quiet presence. There was a rhythm to our talks, a flow that made the hours slip by unnoticed. Mr. Sterling spoke with a calm confidence, his words measured but meaningful. I began to understand the depth of his thoughts, the way he carried years of experience with a mixture of pride and quiet regret. One evening, as the city lights hummed in the background, Mr. Sterling didn't invite me to his apartment. Instead, he lingered after everyone else had left. "David," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual, "would you mind staying a little longer? I could use the company." A shiver went down my spine, not from fear, but from a sense of anticipation that was both exciting and terrifying. "Of course, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice calm despite the racing of my heart. We went back to his office, and he closed the door behind us with a soft click. The sound, so ordinary, felt suddenly loaded with meaning. I settled into the chair, the familiar space suddenly feeling intimate and charged. He poured us both another glass of whiskey, and we talked, as we always did. But tonight, the air was different, thick with unspoken emotions. We talked about everything and nothing, just like always. We talked until the city lights outside seemed to become the only thing that mattered. The conversation turned deeper, more personal than before. There was a confession in his voice, an undertone of something I couldn't quite place. He admitted to the years of loneliness, the feeling of being trapped in a life he no longer recognized. He admitted that I was the only person he had felt this comfortable around for as long as he could remember. He stopped talking, his gaze locking with mine across the dim lighting of the room. The space between us seemed to shrink, and before I knew it, I was leaning closer, drawn to the warmth of his presence. When our lips finally met, it was tentative, a careful exploration of the emotions we'd both been holding back. His touch was gentle but firm, his years of experience evident in the way he moved, the way he held me, as if I were something precious. It wasn't rushed or frantic, it was steady, deliberate, and filled with a depth of feeling that left me breathless. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I didn't think this was possible," he admitted, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Neither did I said, my voice shaky but honest. "But I'm glad it is." For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at ease, as though I'd found a place where I belonged. As I sat there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of Mr. Sterling's presence, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it with him, or was I? I did not know what would come next, but sooner I would definitely find out. The night carried a serene weight, as though the universe itself had paused to take a breath. Mr. Sterling and I remained on the couch, the soft glow of a nearby lamp casting warm shadows on his face. His eyes lingered on mine, a mix of gratitude and trepidation swimming in their depths. I could sense the hesitation in him, the years of restraint and responsibility that threatened to pull him back. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, my hands still resting in his. He nodded, exhaling slowly. "I am. It's been a long time since I let myself feel this way." I smiled, understanding the courage it must have taken for him to admit that. "Me too," I said, though my experience with vulnerability paled in comparison to his. "But I think we deserve this, don't you?" Mr. Sterling's lips curved into a faint smile, but the weight in his eyes remained. "I spent so many years convincing myself that there was only one way to live, that the roles we play, husband, provider, boss, define us entirely. But lately," he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the window, where the moonlight spilled onto the floor, "lately, I've been wondering what else there is." "Lately?" I prompted, leaning in slightly. "Lately I've been wondering what it might mean to choose something for myself, to feel something just because I want to." His words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I squeezed his hand gently, anchoring him to the moment. "You can," I said simply. "And you don't have to apologize for it." He closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing the truth of my words. When he opened them again, there was a quiet determination in his gaze. "You're something else, David," he said, his voice low and filled with a warmth that sent a shiver through me. We sat there for a while, the silence between us filled with the kind of understanding that didn't need words. I could feel the shift in him, the way his shoulders relaxed, and his grip on my hand steadied. He wasn't fighting it anymore, he was allowing himself to be present, to let the moment unfold without resistance. Eventually, he stood, tugging me gently by the hand. "Come with me," he said, his voice soft but firm. I followed him without question, my heart pounding in anticipation. He led me behind his desk, where the space was a little hidden. He pushed aside a few papers, clearing enough for us to lean against it. "I don't want the night to end just yet," Mr. Sterling said, picking up his glass and offering it to me. I took a sip, his fingers brushing mine in a way that sent a jolt of electricity through me. "I like having you here," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "More than I realized I needed." We moved together, bodies pressing close. I reached for his tie, my fingers working to loosen it before I pulled him closer. And there, in his office, surrounded by the ghosts of deadlines and meetings, we gave into the pull we'd been fighting. The world seemed to fall away, the office transforming into our private haven. I had never slept with a man before, but Mr. Sterling really let me feel good. As I looked him in his eyes as we lay beside each other, his eyes were giving me that desire again. "Let's get over that marriage with a little excitement, what do you think?" Oh my God, I had definitely sipped too much wine. I hadn't expected it, but he immediately gave in and kissed me right on the lips, not even thinking of what his wife would think of it. It was a bit soft at first, but I turned it into something deeper quickly. I can't tell you anything of course, but as I went down he looked me in my eyes with those sharp eyes of his. I could see he was enjoying what I did to him. After 10 minutes, we even went further. This was amazing, and he found it amazing too. I can tell you we went on for quite long, I think definitely longer than an hour. When he finished, I lay down, realizing what had just happened, what I had just done. All of a sudden I noticed I turned very sleepy and I must have dozed off very soon after. As the minutes turned into hours, I knew that this was only the beginning of something far greater than either of us had imagined. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds, casting a striped pattern across the office. I woke to the quiet sounds of the city waking up outside, my head resting against Mr. Sterling's chest. His arm was still draped around me, and his breathing was deep and even, a peaceful rhythm that made the world feel safe. For a moment, I stayed perfectly still, savoring the tranquility of the moment. It felt like the kind of morning I'd always hoped for, simple, quiet, and filled with a sense of belonging. Eventually, Mr. Sterling stirred, his eyes fluttering open. As he looked down at me, a slow, warm smile spread across his face, and he gave a soft chuckle. "Good morning," he said, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," I replied, feeling my cheeks warm under his gaze. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. "I can't remember the last time I woke up feeling this content," he admitted, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "Me neither," I said, smiling back at him. "This feels right." "It does," he agreed, his expression softening more than I ever expected it would. We stayed like that for a while, the weight of the world kept at bay by the stillness of the moment. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence with words. Everything we needed to say was spoken in the way we held each other, in the way his hand absent-mindedly traced circles on my arm, in the way our breaths synchronized, as if our bodies had found their own rhythm together. Eventually, the knowledge of the coming workday began to creep in, and Mr. Sterling reluctantly pulled away. "I think I owe you breakfast," he said with a grin, sitting up and stretching. "You don't owe me anything," I said, following him to the small coffee station in his office, "but I'm not going to say no to a cup of coffee." He laughed, the sound light and free. "How do you feel about pastries?" "Perfect," I replied, as he grabbed two from a small box. As he worked, I watched him with a sense of quiet admiration. There was something grounding about the way he moved, his actions steady and purposeful. It reminded me of why I had been drawn to him in the first place, his quiet strength, his ability to make even the simplest moments feel meaningful. When he handed me a cup of coffee, he smiled, and a warmth spread through me. "I wanted to make this morning special," he said, his tone earnest. "You did," I assured him, "more than you know." After our impromptu breakfast we settled back in his office. The weight of the previous night was still hanging in the air, but in a way that felt comforting rather than heavy. Mr. Sterling leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant for a moment before he spoke. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "For so long, I convinced myself that part of my life was over, that it wasn't something I could have anymore." I reached out, placing a hand on his knee. "You can," I said firmly, "and you deserve to." His eyes met mine, and there was a rawness there that made my chest tighten. "It's scary," he admitted, "letting myself feel this way, letting myself want this." "I know," I said softly, "but you're not doing it alone." He nodded, his expression softening. "I don't think I could have done this without you, David. You've made me realize that it's okay to want more, to want something for myself." I leaned in, resting my forehead against his. "And you've shown me what it means to truly connect with someone, to see them for who they are, not who they think they have to be. The moment lingered, the silence between us heavy with unspoken promises. When we finally pulled apart, it was with a sense of quiet resolution. This wasn't just a fleeting connection, it was the start of something that had the power to change us both. As the day wore on, we talked about the future, not in grand, sweeping terms, but in the small, meaningful ways that made all the difference. We spoke of shared lunches, late nights at the office, and the kind of companionship that made even the most ordinary moment feel extraordinary. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known was possible. Mr. Sterling sat beside me at the end of our shift, his hand in mine as we watched the world slow down around us. "You know," he said after a while, his voice soft, "I used to think my best days were behind me. But now I'm starting to believe they might still be ahead." I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. "They are," I said confidently, "and I'll be right here with you." We stayed like that as the night fell, the stars beginning to peek through the darkening sky. The weight of the past no longer felt so heavy, and the uncertainty of the future didn't feel so daunting. All that mattered was the here and now, and the quiet promise of what was to come. I still feel good about what I did. Helping a boss is what we do, don't we? Well, whatever he needs.